Hi, I'm John Fonstock, and I'm going to talk about floating using Dreamweaver to help me code, but it's not necessary to use Dreamweaver. Here's a scenario. We've got a div tag, that's the shell of this web page. It's divided into areas. We've got the top, a nav area, and then a content or middle area that I've named mid. So if you look at the code here, it says mid. It has my content. A lot of times you'll want to have columns. Sometimes they're the exact same size, sometimes they're different sizes, but it works the same way. Essentially, I need to have, if I'm going to divide any div tag, like here's this shell, I've divided it into 3 sections. So just picture me drawing a line across this. Each section should have its own div tag. So the top needs to have a div tag that represents that one area. The navigation has a div tag to represent that area. And then often what's forgotten is that this content could just sit in the shell, but it should also have a div tag wrapped around it, just so I can have ultimate control over all 3 sections. If I wanted to have padding in this middle section, if I didn't have a div tag around it, I'd put the padding on the shell. Of course, it would push the top and the nav across too. So that's just a general rule of thumb. Floating is a property that makes blocked items, div tags, most tags are in block format, to float or sit side by side. So block elements by default just stack. So all of these H1s, paragraphs, they act as little blocks and they just stack. And if you want these items to be side by side, you have to use the property float. So the first thing I want to do is I want to divide this into 2. So I want a line that goes all the way across, and I want 2 sides. So I want my middle divided into 2. Rule of thumb is if I divide it, I need to have 2 div tags, one representing the left, one representing the right. So I've got my content, selecting all my content. I go to my insert bar and just insert a div tag, and I'm going to name this left. It's easy enough. I could make this float. This would certainly go beside it, but I want to have control over both areas. So if you divide one with one div tag, you have to have another div tag to finish that out. So I'm going to put another div tag here. Is that clear? So shell, I've got a top area, a navigation area, a middle area, then the middle is divided into a left and a right, all using div tags. Now that that's set up, I'm going to use CSS, target those 2 attributes, ID left and ID right, and I'm going to use the float property to make them side by side. Generally works with 2 properties. One is it has to have a defined width. If it doesn't have a defined width, if it's set to float, often it'll still stretch across and nothing will float beside it. So this div tag has to be a set width, and it has to be set to float left. The right one has to be a set width and have to be set float right. So I'm going to set that up. CSS styles. I've got my style sheet already linked. I've got my 4 main sections already set. Make a new rule. I'm going to say number sign left, meaning ID left. Say OK. Then I'll go to box. That's where the float property is located. I'm going to give this a width 360. The only reason I know that is I've set it up before. Often you'll have to play a guessing game to get it correct. But the math should work out. If you do the math, this is 600 wide, the padding is 20 on each side, 600 minus 40 divided by 2. So it should work out exactly. So the width is 360, and I want to float this left. Click apply, and as you can see, it starts to work. My column left is floating, and my column right is on the right. Let's go ahead and switch to design mode so we can look at what's happening. If you can see what's happening, it's floating, but it's just wrapping around. This column right is on this side, but I don't have any defined area. So even though sometimes it seems like it's working, you'll still probably want to float this right. Also notice, a lot of people get flustered at this point. Floating div tags do not stretch their container out. Let's take that float off for a second. If I take this float off, just say float none. This is stretching out its container. So the mid div tag is stretching out the shell, and everything is acting accordingly. But as soon as you set that to float, the container starts to collapse. Certainly looks askew now, but there's a fix to that. So you just kind of have to understand that that is a problem, and you keep going. So let's make one for the column right. New style, number sign right, should be on ID. Going to box, float right, don't forget the width, 360, apply, and now that is the appropriate width, and my shell is fully collapsed, which is something I don't want. So if we test this, notice that this box should be around both of them, but since they're both floating, the containing divs don't stretch to float around or to stretch around floating objects. So how do you fix that? It's pretty easy. It's kind of hacky. Hopefully they'll fix this with the new versions of HTML and CSS. But what I need is something that is not floating to stretch this out, and it should be the very bottommost. It should be the bottommost thing, and that will stretch that out. So let's add some more code here. Here we've got our mid. That's the area we're dealing with. And we've got two div tags left and right. Right underneath the right. Should be inside mid, so inside this closing div, but right underneath the right, or the bottommost one, we want to insert a div tag. I'm going to just label this clear, ID clear, name it whatever you want. It's got some text in there which we can delete. This might be a footer, so you just say footer, and I'm going to go to my CSS styles and write a new rule for that. Let's go back to our split view. When we test this, notice that that clear is already starting to stretch that down. This is not set to float. It's on the bottommost. It's underneath this right, so it's stretching that out because it's not set to float. But we want that to stretch both of these down. So to get that to do that, we just have to add one property for this div. So I'm going to make a new rule. That clear attribute, number sign clear. Go up to box and say clear both. And what clear means is ignore float. So it's a lot like text wrap, or the ignore text wrap feature. Sometimes you want text to wrap around an image, and sometimes you don't. So this is the kind of the ignore text wrap or ignore float. And what it's going to do is ignore this left and ignore this right. And since it's not floating, the content's going to stretch around it, or the shell's going to stretch around that. So click apply. You can see that that is stretched down. Let's test that. Click refresh. There we go. Fully cleared. This little tag down here, normally you come in here and just take that out. Normally you wouldn't use a div tag unless there was some content or something, but this is the only viable workaround that I've found. So there you go. Good luck.